There is a pattern that has slowly yet consistently established itself throughout the course of One Piece, in which groups with one leader and a handful of roughly 5 main subordinates are ultimately revealed to contain a traitor to the rest of the group. With Doflamingo and his 5 elite officers, Rocinante was the traitor. With Judge and his 5 children, Sanji was effectively the traitor. If you've seen my Aruj video, with Enel and his 5 original priests, Aruj was the traitor, and hell, you could even stretch this to Kanjuro being the traitor of the 9 red scabbards, or Drake being the traitor of the 6 Toby Roppo. Oda has repeatedly been hammering into the audience's minds the idea of nearly every single group like this having one secret traitor. But the group most important to this discussion is with Vegapunk and his 6 satellites, of which York was the traitor. And the reason that is so important is because Stella and the satellites are at this point basically an explicit parallel to Emu and the Gorosei. Both groups are affiliated with the world government and live in their own land above the clouds, each bear the literal numbers of ranks as part of their designs, and both begin to feature prominently in the Egghead Island arc. In fact, there's even been a long-running theory that the Gorosei are literal satellites of Emu, a theory which I'm subscribing to more and more day by day. All this is to say, if Vegapunk's satellites contained a traitor who was secretly working for Emu's side, then maybe what are essentially Emu satellites also contained a traitor who was working for the side of Joy Boy. Well, I think there is, and I also think that by the end of this video you'll hopefully be as convinced as I am that that traitor is Saint Shepherd Jupiter. So why Jupiter specifically? I mean, doesn't it seem like a bit of a stretch to call any of the Gorosei a secret traitor when we know so little about them, and of what little of them we do have, there's hardly any distinction between the members? Well, sure, but the flip side of that is that because the Gorosei are so important, and because they appear so infrequently, it's much more likely that what little of them we do have is way more likely to be significant. And on that note, let's talk about the first piece of information we ever learn about Jupiter, that being his physical appearance. One Piece is of course a manga, meaning everything about a character's design was an intentional decision by its author Oda, and thus potentially carries meaning. So what can we glean from Jupiter's design? Well, firstly and most importantly, Jupiter looks by far the youngest out of all the Gorosei, the least wrinkles on his face, the most colour in his hair and skin. This immediately planted the idea on an initial read-through for me, and for likely many other readers as well, that this Gorosei might potentially be the least antiquated, least stuck in his ways, and perhaps even the most reasonable voice in the literal room of authority. At the very least, this is the initial impression it creates for the reader, and while Oda promptly demonstrates in his subsequent appearances that Jupiter is hardly the good apple of the bunch, at least on the surface, even today that specific design choice still, at least superficially, puts across that idea. Regardless of anything else, it still works to visually distinguish Jupiter from the rest. Could Oda have perhaps made him look the youngest to represent his being the most connected to the coming new era, the era of Luffy, and the furthest from the ancient ways of Emu in the past? Maybe. One more thing I want to bring up regarding Jupiter's blonde hair. Let's take the cases of Doflamingo and his officers, Judge and his sons, and Vegapunk and his satellites. The former is an explicit parallel to Emu and the Gorosei in numerous ways, and the latter two were both cases in which the subordinates were artificially manufactured clones of their leader, which would parallel the Gorosei if they too were satellites of Emu. In all 3 of these cases, there was one blonde-haired subordinate who was the one to ultimately betray/defect from the rest of the group. Similarly, Jupiter is the one blonde-haired subordinate among the Gorosei. Not saying anything. There's also Jupiter's clothes. Although Venustero's robes are the most obviously different from the suits the other 4 Gorosei wear, what's more interesting to me is the way each Gorosei wears them. Saturn, Mars, Walküre, and even Venusjuro all wear their respective garments very tight, very formally, they all fit their clothes very well. Meanwhile, Jupiter consistently wears his suit a bit looser. His shirt is slightly less done up, his collar isn't as tucked in, he doesn't wear a tie unlike the others. On a visual level, this perhaps communicates the idea that Jupiter isn't as committed to his role as a Gorosei. On both a figurative and literal level, the suit, i.e. the position of elder, doesn't fit Jupiter as well as it does the others. There's also Jupiter's scar. While the other 2 scarred Gorosei members, Walküre and Saturn, wear their scars proudly on their faces, Jupiter partially covers his up. This may hint more broadly to the idea of Jupiter secretly bearing some uglier details to his character that he's trying to cover over, such as him being a traitor. There's also just the positioning of him in this scene and in the majority of the Gorosei's appearances. When the Gorosei are all in a row together, Jupiter is nearly always placed last. This makes it so, as you read the manga from left to right, you witness all the other Gorosei before you witness him, which in turn allows the reader to build up in their mind an idea of what the average Gorosei looks like, which only makes Jupiter's differences stand out even more in comparison. There's also the way this chapter is structured. Oda is no stranger to placing two seemingly unrelated pages next to each other, only for those two things to later be revealed to be linked. An example that comes to mind is in Wano, when Oda first introduces Hiyori going under the alias of Komurasaki, only for the final page of that chapter to be Momo talking about his long-lost sister, Hiyori. Or even this chapter. Chapter 233 starts with Bellamy's defeat in Jaya and ends with Doflamingo's introduction, foreshadowing that the next time we would see either would be Doflamingo in Jaya chastising Bellamy for being defeated. So the fact we get Jupiter's introduction in the penultimate page and then Doflamingo's and Kuma's introduction in the final page may suggest the two are linked. Doflamingo and Jupiter are both celestial dragons with blonde hair, tan skin, and a partially revealed chest. Doflamingo later turned out to be a former celestial dragon who defected. Could Jupiter eventually end up the same when he gets discovered as a traitor? You also have Kuma, who is a literal revolutionary that was temporarily working with the world government for his own ends. Could this be the true nature of Jupiter as well? Now let's move on to their names. Setting aside the planetary-inspired first names, which I'll get onto later, even just the surnames of the Gorosei are revealing. All of the Gorosei surnames, aside from Jupiter's, are broadly references to the excessive, wealth, fame and power associated with the Gorosei and the Celestial Dragons more broadly. The Baron in Ethan Baron is a title of nobility. Barons were medieval-era aristocrats whom the peasants would work for. Topman can either be interpreted literally as the man at the top, but could also be referencing top hats, which are highly reminiscent of specifically the Victorian-era British aristocracy. Marcus as a name is commonly associated with Roman emperors, most famously Marcus Aurelius, and J. Garcia is the most difficult one to connect. I did find something about an extremely high up and powerful United States senator for Puerto Rico called J. A. Garcia Gregory, who was born in San Juan and was personally appointed his immense position by Bill Clinton, which happened roughly 2 years before Saturn was first introduced into the story, so it's possible Oda would have heard of him. At the very least, a J, as in the bird, are known for their bright colours, which has led to them historically being associated with wealth, flashiness, etc. Meanwhile, Jupiter's surname is Shepherd, a much more working class and generally much more humble sounding profession, which is all to do with dedicating one's life to raising and taking care of others, which stands in direct contrast to the other elders' far more fancy and aristocratic sounding surnames, perhaps indicating that Jupiter is less connected to the lavish and aristocratic lifestyle of a celestial dragon and of a Gorosei than the others are. And again, not only is Jupiter placed at the end of the Gorosei in the page that reveals their names, which serves to further highlight his surname breaking the pattern built up by the rest, but he is specifically placed right next to Ethan Baron, with shepherds historically being one of the main professions that medieval barons would lord over, directly contrasting the two. Jupiter is a sandworm, the only one among the Gorosei who isn't based off a Japanese yokai, and again Oda placing him at the end of the line further distinguishes him as being the odd one out in this regard. But also think about the power itself. In a real-life context, the idea of a sandworm is usually associated with sandy desert areas a la Dune. What's the first and really only example of a sandy desert area in One Piece? Alabasta, the kingdom ruled by the Nefertaris, who were noted to be the one family of the 20 kings that abandoned their status as celestial dragons, so in a roundabout way, Jupiter's transformation already associates him with Alabasta, with the Nefertaris, and thus also with the idea of defecting from the celestial dragons. Speaking of Jupiter's power, traitors in One Piece normally have powers that broadly revolve around deception in some way, as befitting of their being the traitor. Corazone's sound fruit could cancel the noise he produced, which allowed him to successfully sneak up on people multiple times in Law's flashback. Sanji's Germa power was named Stealth Black and was straight up the power of invisibility, and Kanjuro's brush fruit was literally the power to create illusions. Similarly, Jupiter's sandworm power primarily works in combat by Jupiter hiding himself from his opponent by burying underground and then surprise attacking them as he suddenly emerges from underneath them when they're not expecting it. But okay, is there anything about Jupiter's character specifically, anything he's actually done or said, that may hint to him being a secret traitor? To which I say, there's actually a fair bit. If you look at the way Oda normally does traitors that are kept secret from both the other characters and the audience for a significant amount of time, i.e. Kanjuro or York, the traitor's character is nearly always one of the least standout and least important of their group. This simultaneously enables Oda to not draw the audience's attention to them too much, thus keeping the eventual twist surprising, while also serving as a piece of foreshadowing to their being the traitor, in that the traitor was actively trying to not draw attention to themselves and not make too much genuine progress for the group. And it just so happens that Jupiter is arguably the least standout and most passive among the 5 elders. Firstly, if you look through every major appearance of the Gorosei, Jupiter always generally seems the least enthusiastic, rarely ever talking in specifics or really pushing the conversation forward. For example, in his introduction, while the other Gorosei are wondering what Shanks' next move will be, or who should replace Crocodile as warlord, Jupiter vaguely refers to the idea of the 3 powers needing to be preserved. Not only does he not say anything, but he's the only one not even in shot when the Gorosei talk about Aokiji leaving Marine HQ. He doesn't say anything when Spandam asks them about how he should proceed with acquiring Pluton for the world government. This theme of Jupiter being the least standout also extends to his monster design. In chapter 1085, when we get the silhouettes of all the Gorosei, Jupiter's is the least distinguishable and least unique of all other designs, seemingly another instance of Oda trying to hide Jupiter among the crowd. However, perhaps the most telling instance of this is when, during a conversation wherein the Gorosei discussed their broader plans for the future, including things like erasing lights from history and starting a great cleansing, arguably the most extreme and destructive the Gorosei have ever sounded up until this point, Jupiter is the only one to say absolutely nothing, keeping his mouth shut completely, not pushing them in any direction. So simply Jupiter's inactive and more bland nature is already suspect, as it aligns with the way Oda has historically written secret traitors. However, there are numerous other instances in which Jupiter's various moments of quote-unquote passivity are seemingly just a detriment to the world government. For example, after the Summit War, when the other Gorosei are trying to figure out things like who the replacement warlord should be, Jupiter suggests they should just sit back and wait for the candidates to reveal themselves. Then, when the other elders talk about how much of a threat Blackbeard is, Jupiter simply mentions the other pirates he thinks could take them down. In both of these instances, Jupiter, regardless of whether he's aware of it or not, is essentially persuading the other Gorosei to use less of their power and just wait for an explosion of powerful pirates so that some of them could maybe become warlords, and by not taking down Blackbeard before he gets even stronger. On both fronts, the Gorosei seemingly allowed these suggestions over the following 2 years, and on both fronts the world government ended up worse off as a result. However, if Jupiter was secretly a traitor, both of these suggestions would be better explained as him intentionally trying to weaken the world government's grip on power. In response to Sakazuki suggesting the Gorosei should do more to ensure people like Doflamingo don't become a problem again, Jupiter responds by saying that they've already sent Cypherpole, another instance of Jupiter being the one among the Gorosei to subtly shut down the idea that the Gorosei should use more of their reach. And funnily enough, Jupiter's response is essentially what causes Akainu to blow up at the Gorosei even more, with him essentially saying that Cypherpole isn't enough. If Jupiter was secretly a traitor, perhaps this could be better explained as him purposefully antagonizing a man he knew was already angry with them for not doing enough, in order to further strain marine world government relations. When Shanks visits the Gorosei, Saturn, Venustero, and Warcury initially all antagonistically question why Shanks is there, only for then Jupiter to say that they arranged this time on Shanks' request. With this line, Jupiter is simultaneously the one to assure Shanks that they're willing to continue with the negotiations which in turn would assumedly assist Shanks in some way, while also demonstrating to the audience that he's the one most willing to associate himself with and even assist powerful pirates like Shanks who in all likelihood want the world government destroyed. And finally, later on in the aforementioned scene where the Great Cleansing is mentioned, Jupiter, alongside Venustero, doesn't say anything about erasing lights to Emu. However, he is the one Gorosei to praise Emu upon first seeing them. This could almost be viewed as though he's trying to get on Emu's good side, but not truly being enthusiastic enough to follow their more extreme plans. Could he instead be trying to cozy up to Emu for another reason? Potentially. Now, sure, none of these examples provide a definitive smoking gun for Jupiter being the traitor, but at the same time, Oda never gives us a smoking gun for him not being the traitor either. something that's a lot harder to say for, well, literally every other Gorosei at this point. Walkiri is consistently portrayed as the most aggressive, most enthusiastic among the Gorosei. Venus-Jiro is the one to initially put forward the Great Cleansing, and is so clearly an eventual Zoro opponent that he's unlikely to dip out at any point. Saturn's had the entirety of Egghead to prove that he's a bastard, and as of the most recent chapters, even Mars, who had previously been the most standby alongside Jupiter, has pretty clearly demonstrated that he's not fucking around either. Meanwhile, Jupiter never really has a moment that seriously weakens him being a potential traitor. He's consistently portrayed as the most passive, the most neutral, and the least passionate among the 5 elders. Point being, if Oda were secretly writing Jupiter to be the traitor this whole time, the way Jupiter's been portrayed is pretty much exactly what that would look like. Even just looking at what Jupiter's done on Egghead, he's fighting Luffy alongside 2 other Gorosei, meaning that if he secretly doesn't want Luffy to lose, he can simply let the other 2 do most of the work and not have any unique responsibilities like Venus-Jiro or Mars do. And even among those 3, Saturn's been fighting Luffy this whole time, and Walkiri had this huge showing of strength. Meanwhile, the only notable thing Jupiter's done so far is try to attack Luffy before getting eviscerated by the giants, and then taking an entire chapter to slowly recover. Regardless whether or not Jupiter was truly fighting against Luffy full force to maintain the facade, which is something we've seen Oda do with Kanjuro by the way, that still doesn't change the fact that Oda is subtly associating Jupiter in the audience's minds with being the most minimal threat among the elders, perhaps so that it eventually feels less out of nowhere when Jupiter is revealed to have been a traitor this whole time. However, I've still neglected to mention what are, to me, the most obvious ways in which Oda has made Jupiter look uniquely sus in the story so far. In chapter 433, we're shown a brief scene wherein the Gorosei learn that Shanks and Whitebeard are meeting. We know from the way the world government later reacts to the news that Big Mom and Kaido are meeting that an alliance between 2 emperors is essentially considered the biggest possible threat to the world government's existence. And so if Jupiter is secretly a traitor to the government, this news would theoretically be huge to him, potentially even more so than it would be for the other Gorosei. And so, what does it say that in this scene, Oda elects to only show Jupiter's unique reaction, where he's drawn shaded against a black background, sweating? Now, sure, this could just be Oda using one random Gorosei to represent all 5, sweating at the potential threat to their regime that this meeting could pose, but with everything else I've said so far, is it possible instead that Jupiter's reaction is the only one Oda highlights because it's either more important than, or different from, those of the other 4? That the reason he's sweating is not dread, but perhaps excitement, and that the reason he's drawn in darkness is because he harbours secret dark intentions towards his contemporary elders. Jupiter is noticeably drawn as the last to rise up to face Sabo in the scene in the throne room in chapter 1085. Could this potentially indicate that Jupiter is more reluctant to attack Sabo than the others? In both chapters 1037 and 1044, Jupiter is decidedly the most interested in and most knowledgeable about the Nika fruit, seemingly the one time he's the most enthusiastic about anything among the Gorosei. In 1037, while Walkiri and Venus-Jiro largely dismiss the idea of the Nika fruit awakening, Jupiter yells at them with sweat running down his face, persuading them of the possibility that it could do. Just like with his reaction to Shanks and Whitebeard meeting, while this could simply be read as Jupiter being fearful of the Nika fruit's awakening, it could also secretly betray a degree of excitement and anticipation. Then in 1044, Jupiter is the one to deliver all the exposition on the Nika fruit's true identity, perhaps implying he's more invested in it than the others. But moreover, Jupiter is the character out of any in the story Oda could have chosen to dramatically and somewhat triumphantly announce Nika's return. Clearly, Oda has deliberately written this dialogue in a way that hypes up Nika for the audience, but we have to remember that at the same time, Jupiter the character is also, in the same way, hyping up Nika. He praises Nika as a god that brings smiles to the faces of people, only describing him in a positive light, not a single mention of the dangers that he poses to the government or anything like that. Now sure, while you could read this as the Gorosei being so evil that they just automatically associate smiling faces as a bad thing, the idea that Jupiter is really just describing Nika so positively because that's how he genuinely sees him makes a lot more sense to me. In the scene with the Gorosei's name reveals where Imu requests that the Mother Flame be used on Lelucia Kingdom, every single other member of the Gorosei says something which can only really be read as supporting the decision. However, Jupiter speaks of bringing this ancient battle to its conclusion, assumingly referring to the battle with the ancient kingdom, Joy Boy, the D clan. But what's interesting about that is that this statement doesn't necessarily reveal which side he wants to win. In fact, we know ultimately that the conclusion of this ancient battle will be the world government side losing to Joy Boy. And so, in that context, it kinda makes it look like that's what Jupiter is wishing for here. And furthermore, for all intents and purposes, the world government's ancient battle has already concluded. It concluded 800 years ago in the world government's favour. So the fact that Jupiter sees the battle as still yet to be concluded may reveal that he is talking from the side of the ancient kingdom and of Joy Boy, the side which would make more sense to be the ones who felt that the battle isn't over because they were the side which lost. I've brought up this parallel shot between Doflamingo's officers and Imu's Gorosei multiple times this video already, but let's actually think about it for a moment. If this is an intentional parallel, let's compare the order of characters. From left to right it goes Pica, Diamante, Virgo, Treble on one side, and Mars, Venus, Juro, Walkyrie, Saturn, Jupiter on the right side, which we can see from the order of the Gorosei at the bottom of the page being the order they appear in from Imu's perspective, and thus in opposite to how they appear to ours. However, the parallel is broken slightly by the fact that one panel has 4 characters bowing and the other has 5. Obviously, in Doflamingo's case, the 5th missing is Corazon, which made sense as he ended up being the one not truly aligned with that group. Now, notice how in both panels, some of them are wielding staffs, clubs, swords, etc. And what's more, it's the same order in both. Numbers 1 and 3 aren't wielding anything, and numbers 2 and 4 are. This means that Jupiter, as the number 5 on the end there, is the Gorosei member that breaks with the pattern to Doflamingo's panel, the odd one out that literally doesn't align with the pattern of the other 4 Gorosei, and so, in a way, if Pica, Diamante, Virgo, and Treble parallel Mars, Venus, Juro, Walkyrie, and Saturn here, in that order, then Jupiter is essentially the parallel to Corazon. So at this point I've pretty much gone through every single scene in which the Gorosei appear, and pointed out these subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways in which I think why Oda has secretly been setting up Jupiter to ultimately be a traitor. However, there are 2 more major things I feel boost this theory significantly more. Firstly, names. Imu's surname is Nerona, and while this doesn't mean anything on its own, there are multiple potential meanings that could be derived from it. For example, the Nero in Nerona is seemingly a reference to the tyrannical Roman Emperor Nero, most infamous for reigning over Rome during a great fire that nearly destroyed the city. Now let's look at Saint Shepherd Jupiter's name. Ever wondered why Oda specifically chose to separate his first name from the default Jupiter into Ju and Peter, and thus effectively making his name Saint Peter? Well, did you know that there was historically a real-life Saint Peter who was executed by Emperor Nero for being a Christian, or in other words, for following a different, much more forbidden god than what the reigning empire of the time approved of. This is seemingly a massive hint to the idea that the reigning emperor of the world government, Nerona Imu, will eventually execute Saint Shepherd Jupiter for following the forbidden sun god Nika rather than the official gods of Imu and the celestial dragons. And what's more, the real-life Jupiter was executed by being put on the cross. How does the world government execute traitorous celestial dragons like Miosgard? By putting them on the cross, the same cross that makes up the Ju of Jupiter's name in Japanese. So both parts of Jupiter's forename seem like potential hints to him one day betraying the celestial dragons by following Nika and subsequently being executed for it. Furthermore, Christian imagery has already been tied directly to Nika in One Piece. Kuma, the most explicitly Christian-themed character in One Piece who prays in a church with a cross, is also the most explicit worshipper of Nika in the series. So it could very well be that what we consider Christian imagery is just Nika imagery in One Piece, making all of Jupiter's Christian connections suddenly much more suspect. And it sure is convenient that we get all of this stuff tying Christian imagery to Nika right before the Gorosei first begin to involve themselves in the main story. Almost as if Oda wants the audience to be thinking of the association between Christian imagery and Nika, just as Jupiter really starts to be focused on. There is one last thing I want to talk about here, which is, what do I actually mean by Jupiter being the traitor? Am I really suggesting that Jupiter was a secret spy of Joy Boy who joined Imu, planning to take them down from the beginning, only to then let Imu and the world government defeat the ancient kingdom and watch by as they plunge the world into 800 years of misery, just so, What, he could get, I don't know, one surprise backstab on Emu during the final war, only to get fucking executed? No, that would be way too much of a stretch. What I think is more likely is that Jupiter is genuinely just a shithead celestial dragon who definitely likes being at the top of the world, likes having all of this luxury and power, but just isn't as extreme as Emu and the other Gorosei. He probably just doesn't buy into the bullshit of the celestial dragons being gods as much, and probably thinks stuff like the Great Cleansing is taking it too far. And while he may initially have fought with his whole heart against Joy Boy for the world government, over time he might simply realise just how evil his boss and colleagues are, and over time has come to rely on the possibility of Nika's return, as well as taking various steps to try and subtly push the world government towards destruction using what little agency he has. And that's all for today, guys. If you have any other thoughts on this theory, please be sure to put them in the comments below. Remember to like the video as it's greatly appreciated, and I'll see you all in the next one. The former is an explicit parallel to Emu and the Gorosei. You witness all the other Gorosei before you is how it would affect the final war matchups. So both parts of Jupiter's forename seem like potential hint. Fuck me.